the ocean remembers everything. Hidden beneath cold, dark waters lies the unfinished future of World War II. A future that almost arrived too late. Historians like Dr. Michael Gannon and Rolf Dieter Müller have often described the German Type XXI U-Boat as the submarine that changed naval warfare without ever truly fighting it. Former Allied naval analysts later admitted something even more unsettling. Had it appeared earlier, the Battle of the Atlantic might have ended very differently. So what happens to a weapon that was decades ahead of its time, but born in a collapsing world? My name is Knightley. I've spent years walking through museums, reading declassified reports, and listening to veterans and historians who stood at the edge of history's turning points. War history isn't just about who won or lost. It's about what survived and why. Today, I want to ask you, why did Nazi Germany build the Type XXI? Why were Allied navies both terrified and fascinated by it? And when the war ended, where did these submarines actually go? The Type XXI U-Boat was not just another submarine. It was a revolution streamlined for underwater warfare, faster submerged than on the surface, and designed for a future that no one had seen before. But revolutions don't disappear quietly. So join me as we uncover what happened to the most advanced submarine of World War II after the guns fell silent. This is not just a story of steel and engines. It's a story about lost potential, secret technology races, and echoes that still shape modern navies today. The rise and legacy of the Type XXI U-Boat before the war ended. The birth of a legend. Before we can understand what happened to the Type XXI after the war, we need to understand why it existed at all. No weapon like this appears by accident. By 1942, Nazi Germany was losing the Battle of the Atlantic. Early war U-boat successes had collapsed under Allied technological pressure. Radar-equipped patrol aircraft, improved sonar, ASTIC, escort carriers, and coordinated convoy tactics turned the Atlantic into a killing ground for German submariners. Traditional U-boats, types 7 and 9, were effectively obsolete while still in production. German naval commanders knew the truth, but rarely admitted it publicly. The submarine fleet was being destroyed faster than it could be replaced. In response, Admiral Karl Dönitz and German naval engineers pursued a radical idea: stop building submarines that behave like surface ships. Instead, they would create a submarine designed to live underwater, not merely hide there. This vision gave birth to the Type XXI, officially known as the Electroboot. Its purpose was simple and ambitious: stay submerged almost permanently, outrun enemy escorts underwater, attack without surfacing, break Allied dominance through speed and stealth. The development began in 1943 under extreme pressure. Germany was already losing industrial capacity due to Allied bombing. Shipyards were damaged, skilled labor was scarce, time was running out. Yet, despite these conditions, the Type XXI pushed submarine design 20 years ahead of its time. Engineering strengths. The Type XXI introduced features never before combined in a single submarine. Streamlined hull, optimized for underwater movement. Huge battery capacity, more than double earlier U-boats. Underwater speed up to 17 knots, faster than many surface escorts. Snorkel system allowing diesel operation while submerged. Advanced sonar for passive target detection. 6 bow torpedo tubes with rapid reload capability. Hydraulic reloading, enabling multiple attacks in minutes. Naval historian Eberhard Rössler later stated that the Type XXIs redefined what a submarine was supposed to be. Engineering weaknesses. But the program had serious flaws. Rushed modular construction caused alignment issues. Poor quality welding due to untrained labor. Electrical system failures. Mechanical unreliability. The submarine was revolutionary, but unfinished. The political motivation behind the Type XXI was desperation. Germany no longer aimed to win decisively. It aimed to delay defeat long enough for a technological miracle to shift the balance. The Type XXI was that miracle. Or at least, it was supposed to be. First, combat deployments. The cruel irony of the Type XXI is that it arrived too late. By late 1944 and early 1945, the first Type XXI boats began sea trials. Crews were stunned by its performance. Veteran submariners described it as feeling like a spaceship compared to older boats. One officer later recalled, "For the first time, we felt the enemy was the one blind and slow." However, these submarines entered service when Germany's infrastructure was collapsing. Fuel shortages, bombed ports, untrained replacement crews, constant Allied surveillance. Only a handful of Type XXI boats conducted limited patrols before the war ended. None achieved confirmed combat sinkings. Still, Allied intelligence took notice immediately. Captured radio intercepts and reconnaissance reports alarmed British and American naval planners. Even without combat results, the potential threat was obvious. Allied responses included intensified anti-submarine patrols, emergency studies on German submarine advances, post-war intelligence prioritization. Psychologically, the Type XXIs represented a chilling possibility. What if Germany had deployed this in 1942 instead of 1945? Many Allied officers later admitted the answer was uncomfortable. Peak influence. The Type XXI became iconic not because of what it did, but because of what it almost did. In raw numbers, over 118 Type XXI submarines were completed or near completion. Hundreds more were planned. None changed the war's outcome. But its design marked a turning point in naval warfare. Why was it feared and respected? It reversed the hunter-prey dynamic underwater. It rendered existing escort tactics outdated. It proved submarines could dominate beneath the surface. Historian Clay Blair, a former US Navy officer, later wrote, "The Type XXI was the most important naval development of World War II, arriving just too late to matter." Milestones. First submarine designed for continuous submerged operations, foundation of modern attack submarine doctrine, blueprint for Cold War naval strategy. The Type XXI was not a battlefield legend, it was a technological prophecy. Collapse of the old world. By early 1945, Germany was unraveling. Factories producing Type XXI components were bombed. Submarines sat unfinished in flooded docks. Others were hurriedly commissioned with barely trained crews. Some were scuttled by their own crews to avoid capture. Others were abandoned in ports, rivers, and shipyards as Allied forces advanced. The strategic role of the Type XXIs shifted overnight, from war-winning weapon to bargaining chip to technological prize. As Nazi Germany surrendered in May 1945, the oceans fell silent. But the story of the Type XXI did not end there. It had only just begun. And then, the world changed. The war ended. The battlefield went silent, but the story of the Type XXI U-Boat had only begun. The war ends. The fate of the Type XXI U-Boat begins chaos of surrender and seizure. The end of World War II did not arrive with order. It arrived with collapse. In May 1945, Germany's naval infrastructure was in ruins. Ports were wrecked by bombing, shipyards flooded or abandoned, command structures shattered. The once feared Kriegsmarine no longer issued orders, it dissolved. The Type XXI U-boats were scattered across this chaos. Some lay unfinished in Hamburg, Bremen, Kiel, Danzig, inland assembly facilities connected by canals and rivers. Others sat tied to docks, never having fired a torpedo. A few were at sea, returning blindly to ports that no longer existed in any meaningful sense. When Allied forces advanced, they did not just capture territory, they captured questions. British, American, and Soviet units discovered Type XXI hulls in various states, fully completed but uncrewed, crewed but untested. Half-built sections stored like industrial ruins. British naval intelligence officers later described the scene as a technological graveyard. Some German crews scuttled their boats deliberately, following standing orders to prevent capture. Others surrendered intact, knowing resistance was pointless. In certain ports, Allied soldiers boarded submarines that had never been properly commissioned. The surrender was not uniform. There was no single handover moment. Each Type XXI had its own ending abandoned, flooded, captured, or quietly towed away under Allied flags. The power vacuum. Once the war ended, the Allies faced an immediate dilemma. What do you do with a weapon that belongs to a defeated enemy but represents the future? Officially, the policy was simple. Disarm Germany, destroy its war-making capacity, prevent rearmament. But reality was more complicated. Steel was scarce. Europe needed rebuilding. Scrapping submarines made economic sense. At the same time, intelligence officers, engineers, and naval strategists all saw the same thing. The Type XXI was not just another U-boat, it was a leap forward. This created a power vacuum, not political, but technological. Within weeks, Allied priorities split into two paths. 1. Public destruction, highly visible scrapping to satisfy political agreements. 2. Quiet acquisition, secret towing, documentation, and analysis. Rivalries emerged quickly. The United States wanted full technical access. The Soviet Union wanted complete physical control. Britain wanted to understand how its Atlantic defenses had nearly been outpaced. France and other nations wanted pieces of the future as well. The Type XXI became a bargaining chip in the earliest moments of the Cold War, even before the term existed. Allied discovery and first reactions. Allied naval engineers were stunned when they examined the boats up close. Reports noted hull shapes optimized for submerged travel, battery capacity unmatched by any Allied submarine, internal layouts designed for efficiency rather than habitability, automation that reduced crew workload. One British report described the Type XXI as not an improvement, but a replacement for all previous submarine thinking. American naval observers reached similar conclusions. US Navy submarines were effective, but they still relied on surface travel. The Type XXI challenged that doctrine entirely. The psychological impact was immediate. Allied officers realized something unsettling. They had won the war just before the rules changed. The technology race begins within months. Captured Type XXI submarines were towed to test ranges, stripped down piece by piece, filmed, photographed, and documented, engineers dismantled. Electric motors, battery arrays, snorkel systems, sonar equipment, hull structures. Every component became a lesson. The United States transported several examples for testing and evaluation. The Soviet Union seized others and rapidly integrated German engineers into its naval programs. Britain conducted exhaustive trials to determine how vulnerable its defenses would have been against a fleet of such submarines. This was not curiosity. This was urgency. Each nation asked the same question: how fast can we build something like this, or better? The Type XXI directly influenced early US Navy, Guppy submarine upgrades, Soviet Project 613 and Project 611 submarines, British post-war submarine redesigns. The Cold War submarine race began not in missile silos, but in the steel corridors of captured German U-boats. Secrecy, silence, and controlled destruction. Publicly, many Type XXI submarines were destroyed. They were cut apart, melted down. Recycled photographs showed rows of submarines reduced to scrap, reinforcing the narrative that Nazi military power had been erased. Privately, however, the most important examples disappeared. Some were moved under classified programs. Others were studied for years before being quietly scrapped once their secrets had been extracted. German engineers who had worked on the Type XXI were interrogated extensively. Some were recruited. Others were barred from future work. Their knowledge, however, had already spread. The weapon itself faded, but the ideas did not. From weapon to blueprint. By the late 1940s, the Type XXI no longer existed as a threat. It existed as a blueprint. Its concepts reshaped. Submarine hull design, underwater endurance doctrine, acoustic stealth priorities, crew efficiency standards. What had once been built to break Allied convoys now influenced the submarines that would patrol beneath the polar ice caps and nuclear deterrent routes. The irony was complete. A weapon built in desperation by a collapsing regime became the foundation for post-war naval supremacy across multiple nations. What had once been a weapon of war was now a blueprint for the future. And yet, this raises a haunting question. If the Type XXI shaped the modern world so deeply, where did the actual submarines go? That answer lies in scrapyards, secret programs, museums, and forgotten waters. And that story comes next. Where did they all go? When the war ended, the Type XXI did not disappear in a single moment. It vanished piece by piece, across continents, through policy decisions, rivalries, secrecy, and neglect. The question is not whether the Type XXI survived. The question is how, where, and in what form. Scrapped for resources. The most common fate of the Type XXI was also the least dramatic. It was scrapping. Post-war Europe faced a brutal reality. Cities destroyed, rail networks shattered. Factories reduced to rubble. Severe shortages of steel, copper, and industrial materials. Governments did not view enemy submarines as historical artifacts. They viewed them as raw material. Hundreds of German naval vessels, surface ships, and submarines alike were ordered destroyed under Allied disarmament policies. The Type XXI, despite its advanced design, was not exempt. Entire submarines were cut apart at docks, towed to scrapyards, broken down with torches, melted into ingots. Steel from Type XXI hulls was reused for bridges, railway tracks, industrial machinery, civilian construction. In some cases, the transformation happened within months of surrender. One Allied naval officer later noted, "A submarine that once threatened entire fleets was now reinforcing warehouse beams." For many Type XXI boats, there was no ceremony, no records, no preservation. They simply ceased to exist. This quiet destruction accounts for the majority of completed Type XXI submarines, captured by major Allied powers. While many were scrapped, the most intact and promising Type XXI boats were claimed by the victors. These were not random seizures. They were carefully selected prizes. United States. The US Navy acquired several Type XXI submarines for detailed testing. American engineers focused on hull hydrodynamics, battery endurance, underwater speed, crew automation. Trials confirmed what intelligence had suspected. The Type XXI was superior to any Allied submarine then in service. However, the US Navy chose not to directly replicate the design. Instead, it extracted concepts and applied them to existing fleets. This directly influenced the Guppy, Greater Underwater Propulsion Power Program, which modernized American submarines with streamlined hulls, larger batteries, snorkels, improved sonar. The boats themselves were eventually scrapped, but their DNA lived on. Soviet Union. The Soviet response was more aggressive. The USSR seized multiple Type XXI submarines and fully integrated them into its naval research and development programs. German engineers were interrogated, documented, and in some cases compelled to assist. The result was rapid Soviet submarine development. Project 617, Whiskey class, Project 611, Zulu class. These designs clearly echoed the Type XXI's underwater-first philosophy. Unlike the US, the Soviet Union physically replicated the concept on a massive scale. United Kingdom Britain approached the Type XXI with a mix of relief and concern. Royal Navy trials focused on one question: how close had we come to disaster? British analysts concluded that if deployed earlier and in numbers, the Type XXI could have overwhelmed convoy defenses. While Britain did not mass-produce derivatives, the lessons shaped post-war ASW doctrine, sonar development, submarine countermeasures, France, and others. France received Type XXI boats as part of post-war redistribution. These were used primarily for training, technical study, transitional fleet rebuilding. Other nations, including Poland and Czechoslovakia, handled fragments, components, or documentation rather than complete submarines. Secret programs. Some Type XXI submarines did not go to scrapyards or open trials. They went underground. During the late 1940s and early 1950s, intelligence agencies operated under intense secrecy. Any technology that could shift military balance was hidden from public view. Certain Type XXI boats were towed to remote naval bases, tested in closed waters, Stripped down in restricted facilities, engineers ran experiments involving acoustic signatures, maximum submerged endurance, emergency propulsion failures, silent running techniques. Many records from these programs remain classified or partially redacted. What is clear is this. Some Type XXI submarines vanished without public documentation, their existence known only through scattered memos and declassified fragments. They were not destroyed immediately. They were exploited, then erased. Museum preservation. Only a tiny number of Type XXI submarines survived long enough to become historical artifacts. Museums faced serious challenges: enormous size, severe corrosion, costly restoration, political sensitivity. Preservation required conscious effort at a time when most nations wanted to forget the war, not memorialize enemy weapons. Today, surviving examples exist in Germany, the United Kingdom. Select naval museums. Restoring them was not about glorification, it was about documentation. Curators had to stabilize. Warped hull sections, damaged electrical systems, incomplete interiors. Some museums chose not to fully restore their boats. Instead, they preserved them in raw condition, allowing corrosion and damage to speak for themselves. These submarines are not polished relics. They are warnings frozen in steel. 5 battlefield relics and abandoned survivors. Not every Type XXI was scrapped, captured, or preserved. Some were simply forgotten. As Allied forces advanced and Germany collapsed, incomplete or damaged submarines were abandoned in canals, rivers, coastal inlets, bombed shipyards. Others were scuttled hastily and left where they sank. Decades later, traces remain. Divers have reported hull fragments buried in sediment, rusted sections tangled in debris, collapsed compartments swallowed by silt. On land, remnants exist in overgrown dockyards, flooded dry docks, industrial ruins reclaimed by nature. Occasionally, construction projects uncover steel segments that once belonged to Type XXI hulls, unidentified until markings reveal their origin. As one maritime archaeologist stated, "The ocean keeps what history discards. These remains are silent, inaccessible and decaying, but they are still there." The illusion of total destruction. Official records often suggest that the Type XXI fleet was fully accounted for. Reality is less tidy. Wartime chaos, incomplete documentation, and overlapping Allied claims created gaps. Serial numbers do not always match. Construction logs contradict surrender records. Some boats were dismantled without formal reporting. This has fueled decades of speculation. Were some Type XXI submarines lost at sea? Were hulls buried or deliberately hidden? Did any remain submerged and undiscovered? No credible evidence suggests operational survival, but absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. What is certain is that not every Type XXI can be traced with confidence. Some simply vanished into the fog of history. From fleet to footnote. In the end, the Type XXI did not go to one place, it went everywhere. Into scrap heaps, into Cold War navies, into classified files, into museums, into the seabed. It ceased to exist as a weapon, but became something more enduring. It became a reference point. Every modern submarine carries echoes of the Type XXI. The focus on submerged endurance, the prioritization of stealth, the understanding that underwater dominance decides naval power. The submarines themselves are mostly gone, but their influence never left. The war ended, and the Type XXI scattered across the world, in steel, in secrets, and in memory. But destruction and disappearance are only part of the story. Because even after the submarines were gone, their impact reshaped the world that followed. And that impact comes next. Impact on the post-war world. The Type XXI U-Boat never won battles. It never turned the tide of World War II. And yet, it may have shaped the post-war world more than almost any weapon that actually saw combat. Its true legacy did not unfold in explosions or sinking ships, but in design offices, doctrine manuals, intelligence briefings, and the quiet tension of the Cold War, influence on new military technology. Before the Type XXI, submarines were fundamentally compromised machines. They were fast on the surface, slow underwater, forced to expose themselves to recharge batteries. The Type XXI shattered that limitation. For the first time, a submarine was optimized for continuous submerged operations. This single shift changed everything. United States, from guppy to nuclear power. The US Navy absorbed Type XXI lessons with remarkable speed. Captured data and trials directly influenced the guppy program, which transformed existing American submarines by streamlining hulls, increasing battery capacity, adding snorkels, improving sonar and fire control. These upgrades were not cosmetic. They represented a doctrinal pivot from surface-centric patrols to underwater dominance. The next leap was inevitable. If batteries were the limiting factor, then endurance required a new power source. The conceptual groundwork laid by the Type XXI helped accelerate US interest in nuclear propulsion. While nuclear submarines were not copies of the Type XXI, their mission profile long, stealthy submerged patrols was its logical descendant. Soviet Union, mass production and imitation. The Soviet Union took a different path. Instead of incremental upgrades, it replicated and expanded the Type XXI philosophy at scale. Soviet post-war submarines emphasized underwater speed, adopted streamlined hull forms, increased battery capacity, reduced surface dependence. Within a decade, the USSR built hundreds of submarines inspired by German designs. The underwater arms race began here, not with missiles, but with hydrodynamics and silence. NATO and Warsaw Pact doctrine. Both NATO and Warsaw Pact navies converged on the same conclusion. The future of naval warfare was below the surface. Detection, not firepower, would decide survival. This led to rapid development of sonar networks, anti-submarine warfare aircraft, submarine hunting submarines. The Type XXI forced navies to think 3 moves ahead. Psychological and cultural impact. The Type XXI left scars, not physical, but mental. Veterans and naval officers. Allied sailors who fought in the Atlantic often expressed a strange sense of relief after the war. They had won, but only just in time. Post-war interviews reveal a recurring theme. If they had this earlier, we might not be here. German submariners viewed the Type XXI differently. For many, it symbolized what might have been a technologically superior platform, a chance denied by politics, timing, and chaos. Some veterans later described it as a bitter irony, a perfect machine built for a lost cause. Public perception. In the immediate post-war years, the Type XXI was largely unknown to civilians. But as declassified documents emerged, its reputation grew. It became a symbol of late-war German engineering, a case study in missed opportunity, a cautionary tale about relying on wonder weapons. Books, documentaries, and academic studies framed it not as a villain, but as a turning point. Pop culture and media. While not as famous as tanks or jet fighters, the Type XXI influenced submarine fiction indirectly. Modern depictions of submarines, sleek, silent, submerged hunters, owe more to the Type XXI than to earlier wartime boats. Video games, naval simulations, and Cold War thrillers reflect its design philosophy, even when it is not named explicitly. The idea of the submarine as an invisible predator begins here. Political effects. Weapons do not disappear when wars end, they change roles. The Type XXI played a subtle but important part in post-war politics. Defeated nations, managing the past. For post-war Germany, the Type XXI represented a complicated legacy. It was a technological achievement built under a criminal regime, used for war, not defense. West Germany avoided celebrating it, focusing instead on economic recovery and integration into NATO. Yet German engineers who once worked on the Type XXI found themselves contributing indirectly to post-war naval technology across the world. The knowledge survived, even if the nation tried to move on, victors and propaganda. For the Allies, the Type XXI became proof of 2 narratives. The enemy was dangerous but defeated. Victory came just in time. Public scrapping ceremonies emphasized destruction. Behind closed doors, however, the same technology was studied, copied, and expanded. This duality defined early Cold War politics, public condemnation, private exploitation, diplomacy, and naval balance. As Cold War tensions escalated, submarines became instruments of diplomacy. Their presence was often unspoken, but deeply felt. A submarine could shadow fleets, gather intelligence, carry nuclear weapons. The Type XXI did not carry nuclear missiles, but it shaped the vessels that would. In this way, it indirectly influenced deterrence theory, naval arms control discussions, strategic trust, or the lack of it. The shift in strategic thinking. Perhaps the most lasting impact of the Type XXI was conceptual. Before it, naval power meant battleships, aircraft carriers, surface dominance. After it, power increasingly meant stealth, endurance, invisibility. The oceans became three-dimensional battlefields. This shift forced nations to rethink defense spending, fleet composition, maritime strategy. The Type XXI proved that technological advantage, even when too late, could reshape the future. Legacy without glory. The Type XXI has no victory parades, no decisive battles bear its name, yet its influence is everywhere. It taught the world that innovation can outlive ideology, timing matters as much as technology. War machines can shape peace as much as conflict. The war had ended, but the presence of the Type XXI U-Boat lingered, shaping minds long after its engines stopped. And yet, not all of them vanished into history. A few survived, rusting, silent, forgotten, or preserved. Their final chapter is still being written, and that story comes next. The final survivors. By the early 1950s, the Type XXI U-Boat had almost completely vanished from the world's oceans. Almost. Out of more than 100 completed or near-completed submarines, only a handful escaped the cutting torch, the scrapyard, and the secrecy of Cold War programs. These survivors are rare not because they were protected, but because they were overlooked, repurposed, or deliberately preserved when almost everything else was erased. They are not monuments of victory. They are artifacts of transition, catalogue of remaining units. The surviving Type XXIs, submarines, fall into three broad categories: museum exhibits, research survivors, and derelict remnants. Museum-preserved boats. The most famous surviving Type XXIs is U-2540, later renamed Wilhelm Bauer. Scuttled by its crew in 1945, raised in the 1950s, refitted and used by the West German Navy for testing, eventually transferred to the German Maritime Museum in Bremerhaven. Unlike static displays, U-2540 was operational again after the war, making it one of the only Type XXI submarines to truly live a second life. Today, visitors can walk through its hull and see the compact crew quarters, the massive battery compartments, the streamlined interior layout. It is not glorified. It is presented as engineering cold, efficient, and unsettling. Other preserved hull sections and partial remains exist in German technical museums, naval archives, training facilities. These are often incomplete, showing internal structures rather than finished vessels. Research and testing survivors. A small number of Type XXI submarines survived into the late 1940s and early 1950s as test platforms. These boats were used to evaluate acoustic signatures, study hull fatigue, measure submerged endurance. Once their data was extracted, most were quietly scrapped. Records indicate that some were dismantled decades after the war, long after their public relevance had faded. They did not survive as symbols, they survived as tools, derelict and lost remnants. Not all survivors are visible. Some Type XXI remains still lie in harbor mud, along riverbeds, in coastal waters. These are not intact submarines, but fragments. Bow sections, pressure hull rings, ballast tanks. They are often discovered accidentally during construction or dredging operations. Once identified, many are reburied or documented and removed, too costly and dangerous to recover fully. The value of survivors today. The surviving Type XXI submarines are valuable for reasons that go far beyond nostalgia. Historical value. They represent the transition from WW-era submarines to modern designs. The last phase of German wartime naval innovation. A moment when technology outran strategy. For historians, they are physical proof that the future of warfare often appears before the world is ready for it. Educational value museums use the Type XXI to teach engineering evolution, ethical questions surrounding military innovation, the dangers of late-war desperation. Visitors often leave surprised not by its size, but by its modernity. Research value naval engineers and historians still study. Hull geometry, internal layouts, noise reduction concepts. Even in the age of nuclear submarines, the fundamentals introduced by the Type XXI remain relevant. Auction and collector interest. Complete submarines are never sold, but components occasionally appear. Instruments, valves, gauges. These items fetch high prices, not for decoration, but for documentation. Ownership is tightly regulated, reflecting the seriousness of the artifact. The mystery of the missing units. Despite decades of research, not every Type XXI is fully accounted for. Construction records conflict with surrender logs. Serial numbers vanish. Scuttling reports lack coordinates. This has led to persistent questions. Were some boats sunk during transfer? Were incomplete hulls buried or dismantled without record? Do unidentified wrecks still lie undiscovered? Maritime archaeologists believe it is possible, though unlikely, that undiscovered Type XXI remnants remain underwater. No operational submarines are missing, but pieces of history might still be waiting. The mystery persists, not because of conspiracy, but because of wartime chaos and post-war urgency. Relics without glory. The surviving Type XXI boats are not celebrated. They do not fly flags. They do not carry weapons. They do not symbolize victory. Instead, they represent innovation without time, power without purpose, technology divorced from outcome. Standing inside one, you feel something unusual. Not pride, not fear, but distance. The distance between what humans can build and what they can control. The final witnesses. These submarines are the last witnesses to a turning point. They watched an old world collapse. A new one emerge beneath the waves. They never fired their torpedoes in decisive battle. Yet their influence still patrols the oceans. Steel fades, paint peels, welds corrode, but ideas survive. And the Type XXI idea never truly sank. Only a few of these machines remain silent, heavy, immobile. But their story is not over, because to understand what they mean today, we must return to why this story is told at all. The final chapter is not about submarines. It is about memory, and that is where this journey ends. Conclusion. War machines are built to destroy, but their stories do not end when the war does. The Type XXI U-Boat proves that history is not defined only by battles won or lost, but by what remains afterward, by the ideas that survive defeat, by the technologies that slip quietly from one war into the next era, by the shadows they cast long after the engines fall silent. The Type XXI never became the weapon it was meant to be. It arrived too late, it sailed too little, it fired almost nothing. And yet it changed everything. It was born from desperation, engineered in chaos, and deployed into collapse. It was meant to save a collapsing regime, but instead, it helped shape a world that regime would never see. That contradiction is its legacy. When the war ended, the Type XXI was stripped of its purpose. Some were cut apart for scrap, their steel melted into bridges, factories, and railways. Others were dissected by engineers who understood exactly what they were looking at: the future of naval warfare, hidden inside an enemy hull. A few were preserved not as trophies, but as evidence, and most simply, disappeared. But disappearance does not mean irrelevance. The Type XXI taught the world a lesson it could not ignore. The ocean belongs to those who can stay beneath it the longest, the quietest, and the unseen. Every modern submarine, diesel, electric, or nuclear carries that lesson forward. Not because it copies the Type XXI directly, but because it follows the same logic. Submarines stopped being surface ships that could dive. They became underwater predators that only surfaced when necessary. That shift changed naval doctrine forever. a weapon that outlived its war. There is a temptation in war history to focus only on success, on what worked, what won, what dominated. The Type XXI challenges that thinking. It failed in its original mission, but it succeeded in shaping the future. This is uncomfortable history because it forces us to admit that innovation does not care about morality. Technology does not choose sides. A breakthrough built for destruction can still become a foundation for deterrence, stability, or even peace. The same ideas that once threatened Allied convoys later helped prevent open conflict between nuclear powers. The Type XXI never carried nuclear weapons, but it helped make nuclear submarines possible. That irony cannot be escaped. Memory without celebration. Unlike famous tanks, aircraft, or battleships, the Type XXI has no grand public mythology. There are no victory parades for it, no heroic last stands, no decisive battles etched into national memory. And that may be appropriate, because the Type XXI is not a story of glory. It is a story of potential, timing, and consequence. In museums, it sits quietly. No flags waving, no dramatic lighting, just steel, cramped corridors, battery compartments, and the faint smell of oil and age. Standing inside one, you don't feel triumph, you feel distance. Distance between the engineers who imagined the future and the sailors who never truly got to live in it. Distance between what technology promised and what history allowed. The human cost beneath the steel. It's easy to talk about machines and forget the people. The Type XXI was crewed by young men, many barely trained, sent to sea as their country collapsed behind them. They believed or hoped that this submarine might give them a fighting chance. Most never saw combat. Some never even sailed. Their war ended not with battle, but with surrender, scuttling, or capture. For Allied sailors, the Type XXI became a symbol of something narrowly avoided. A reminder that victory often depends on timing as much as courage. For engineers and historians, it became a case study in what happens when innovation outpaces reality. And for the world, it became a quiet warning. Why this story still matters, you might ask. Why revisit a submarine that never changed the outcome of the war? Because the post-war world was built by lessons learned, not just victories claimed. The Cold War did not begin with missiles. It began with fear, secrecy, and technology races sparked by discoveries like the Type XXI. The oceans became contested spaces not through open battle, but through presence, surveillance, and silence. And that reality still defines global security today. Submarines still patrol unseen, still deter without firing, still carry the weight of peace and destruction in equal measure. The Type XXI sits at the beginning of that story. As I walk through naval museums, abandoned shipyards, and forgotten coastal ruins, I'm reminded why I tell these stories. Because history does not speak loudly on its own. It whispers from rusted hulls, faded documents, and silent wrecks beneath the sea. Every relic has a voice. Every wreck has a memory. Every machine, no matter how destructive, teaches us something about who we were and who we chose to become. The Type XXI does not ask to be admired. It asks to be understood. It asks us to think about how close the world often comes to turning points, how innovation can escape the control of those who create it, how war shapes peace in ways no one plans. The end of the journey, for now. The war ended. The submarines vanished. The oceans grew quiet again. But the echoes remain, in doctrines, in steel hulls sliding silently through deep water, in the uneasy balance that keeps major wars from breaking out. If you want to continue this journey with me through forgotten bunkers, lost prototypes, abandoned shipyards, and the silent bones of history, then stay with me. There are countless echoes of war still waiting to be heard. Thank you for watching, thank you for listening, and thank you for remembering. And now I'll leave you with a question. What forgotten weapon, machine, or idea should we uncover next? Let me know in the comments.